Thanks for staying with us. Now, as autism diagnoses rise, we examine how awareness and understanding are changing across society.
Joining us to discuss the progress in autism assessment and awareness are Dr. Neil Kenny, Associate Professor and Researcher at DCU, and PhD student Carrie Grennan. Thank you both so much for being here. We really do appreciate it. Unfortunately, Neil, autism has become something of a battleground globally when it comes to it being diagnosed, people's understanding of it. And sometimes we forget that at the core, we're talking about human beings.
Yes.
There's a person. And we're talking about people as though they're other, and it's not.
No.
Like, autism, it is about 3%. Is it about 3% of the population?
3.38%.
3.3. So, people are talking about this rise in autism and why it's happening. Why is it happening?
Well, I suppose that's a complicated question. I think the current understandings of autism, that is characterised by differences in communication, differences in social interaction and social presentation, and then differences in interests and preferences for predictability. It's really much more recent, that understanding of it, than people understand. They kind of think it might be something that's always like an unchanging phenomenon, like many medical conditions. But autism isn't a medical condition. And really, since it was first identified, it was only in the 40s. And between then and maybe up to 1980, it was seen as a form of... It wasn't a separate diagnosis itself. It was in under other conditions such as childhood psychosis, childhood schizophrenia, and even when it did become a separate diagnosis in 1980, which is very recent, it was seen as a condition... It was described as infantile autism. It was a condition you gave to children, and overwhelmingly male children.
Yeah.
And it was only in the later 80s and the 90s that it began to be understood as something that had a wider diversity of how it presented, that adults could be diagnosed, that it was something that, while it was there from birth, it ran across people's lives. And, you know, intellectual disability, while it is a co-occurring thing, isn't a core phenomenon associated with it. So you see quite a lot of individuals with high levels of ability, or people that had, quote-unquote, normal cognitive functioning, but had these key identifiers as being autistic. This is quite a recent understanding of it.
Yeah, because we've had this thing where we're hearing about this all the time, like the rise in the amount of autistic people. But it's just, they've been there, we just didn't classify it as that's an autistic person. And now we are realising all this, we're much more aware of it. So that's the case. The rise is not there, or is it?
Well, I mean, the research has constantly changed our understanding, the evidence base of what autism is, who is autistic. So just last August, a study in King's College in London, it suggested from health records in the UK that up to 90% of people over the age of 40 that would meet an autistic criteria for a diagnosis don't have a diagnosis. And that's above 90, it's 97% for people over the age of 60. So by today's criteria, nearly all people from kind of my age upwards, they didn't get a diagnosis. So we're kind of going from a low bar. And the other argument that's made is, well, shouldn't we just narrow the diagnosis criteria? Are we not creating problems for people by medicalising them or whatever? But again, the research evidence is very, very clear that receiving a diagnosis is not a negative thing in cases. So I wrote an article in the Irish Examiner recently just talking about, for example, some of the research on this. So a study in Sweden found that when you look at people presenting at psychiatric outpatient facilities for other issues in their lives, mental health issues and things like this, 1 in 5 met the criteria to be diagnosed as autistic, but they didn't have a diagnosis. And research from the UK among homeless people and among the prison population found that disproportionately, by comparison to the general population, people met a criteria to be diagnosed as autistic, but they never had one. So the argument really that you're creating problems by diagnosing people, I mean, does the evidence stand it up? And just an example in Ireland that we're all aware of. So the number of special classes in schools, which we're about working in the School of Inclusive and Special Education, it's gone up 400% in a decade, and which sounds alarming. So we do understand people's issue, but 10 years ago, the NCSE said that 2/3 of autistic students are in mainstream class places. So if they don't get a diagnosis, they don't get access to very reasonable accommodations, even small stuff like movement breaks, empathy from teachers, understanding and flexibility. So, I mean, getting access to these kind of considerations and supports early in life, surely that's a good thing.
For outcomes, for the betterment of society, and for being preventative rather than coming to the problem afterwards. That's fascinating about the prison population in the UK. Carrie, if we can go to you, you're autistic.
I am.
And when did you get your diagnosis?
So I was 14, which would be considered relatively late in terms of today's standards of diagnosis and how you'd see people diagnosed as boys. But it's still relatively early or average for women's diagnosis and girls' diagnosis. And the only reason I was diagnosed when I was because I grew up in a sphere where I had a brother with intellectual disability and autism. So autism was always something I was aware of and that the adults in my life were aware of. And so I started to think for myself around the age of 12, 13, that kind of seems like me, and brought it to my school counsellor, and it was eventually that triggered a full diagnosis. So.
Why are girls less diagnosed than boys?
So we don't know the exact reason. It seems to be kind of a combination of reasons. But one of the primary reasons, I suppose, is how girls are socialised and how they are viewed by adults. So we all know the phrase, boys will be boys. A lot of the time when people see young boys
acting out, maybe?
Acting out, that and then people tend to hone in on that and realise, OK, maybe my boy is not being a boy. Whereas with girls, rather than it be seen as maybe a need for support there, it's, you need to fix that behaviour now. You need to cross your legs, act like a lady. That, it's not so much those terms these days, but in more subtle ways, girls are taught earlier how to stamp out and get rid of what could be autistic behaviours. And then that also comes from the girls themselves. There's evidence that girls are more socially aware earlier than boys are in development. And so, at least in my experience, I realised very quickly, very early on, don't say that because people are laughing and you didn't mean it as a joke. So, I'd kind of realised where people were picking me up in a way that wasn't intended, and I wouldn't do it anymore. The
socialisation, the kind of sheepification of girls to pick up on social clues in order so that they can blend into the background.
Yes, absolutely.
It is a fascinating area of study. But for you at 14, because we do know in the public model we are falling so far behind in assessment. We know how bad it is and so many people are having to go the private route. It's not exactly what we're going to talk about today, but for you having the diagnosis, I know it's what you've decided to go into in your PhD studies. What did it mean for you?
Oh, it was huge. Because up until then, I had this experience of always having this knowing that other children found me different, and feeling weird and out of place, black sheep. And I had all these kinds of terms that were coming to me and I was internalising them, and that's who I am. And then to get a name for it that was not inherently negative and that meant kinship, companionship, there are other people who have experienced these kinds of things, was huge for me. And it also meant that I could open that dialogue with other people as well. If I could pick up on another child kind of laughing when I didn't mean it, I'd go, oh, sorry, I have autism, why are you laughing? Because I meant it this way. And it opens that dialogue. And then once you've opened that dialogue with people, you get to fight the kind of ignorance around it. I have got some very ignorant comments or questions, but they come from a place of genuine curiosity that wouldn't have come about if I wasn't so open about my autism.
And I suppose, Neil, it is for some a relief that now they are diagnosed and they know why these things are happening to them.
100%, yeah. What Carrie's describing there isn't uncommon in the literature at all. A lot of autistic people do talk about it as an explanation for a constellation of things that they'd already labelled themselves. So in our study with autistic teachers, and we also have under review a study with autistic academics, people working in universities, a lot of them would describe getting their diagnosis late and it replacing previous labels like weird, awkward, unable, or other really quite negative personal character descriptors.
Difficult.
Yes, so again, is labelling creating the issue, or is labelling, which it is, it's like a bureaucratic way of identifying potential shortcut understandings of what needs might be helpful and directing the person towards them. So the idea that you're medicalising, or certainly in the article I quoted some UK politicians tying it to grit and personality characteristics. This is not what we're talking about at all.
You said it's not a medical condition.
No.
In relation to this, there's been causes, there's been shaming of women who carry babies.
Yeah.
Like, it's been really bad. But it feels like we're discussing, why are your eyes blue? Why do you have brown eyes? We're talking about genetics.
Yes.
Not all genetic factors. There are environmental factors. There are many factors, are there?
Yeah, well, I mean, there's not an identified, silver, this is it, cause for autism.
Exactly.
Yeah, there's not,
There's no. Yeah.
So, I mean, the overwhelming influences identified in research are genetic factors, but we need to be clear that they haven't identified an autism gene or any one.
Yes.
There's not any gene therapy kind of thing. It's a complex behaviour.
Yeah.
But, I mean, if you look at that, I suppose the environmental things that are being refloated, things like vaccines, the evidence base for any vaccines associated is extremely poor. The study that underpinned this was identified with severe concerns with the data, and the person who conducted it was struck off by the medical council in another country. So we should be very cautious about that,
Oh,
And
completely.
autism predates, discussions about paracetamol, as you mentioned, with regard to in utero ingestion of paracetamol. So obviously autism was identified and described before paracetamol was invented.
Listen, just really quickly, Carrie, how does it feel for people to be discussing you as an other when they talk about autism? How does that feel?
It's a weird thing to navigate because in one way I've kind of introduced myself as an other into academia as an autistic person, but much like how I found it to be useful to be publicly autistic, let's say, or openly autistic as a teenager, I'm very fortunate that I am verbal and I can communicate in a way that neurotypicals find comfortable. And that's not something that all autistic people can do. And in a way, I feel like that has provided some meaning to me for me to go and navigate neurotypical spaces on behalf of, with, and by platforming other autistic people. I think that's just
And you
the goal.
communicated brilliantly this morning.
Oh, thank you.
Sorry that who you are is a subject of debate currently. It's not right. Carrie Grennan, PhD student of DCU and the School of Inclusive and Special Education, and Dr. Neil Kenny, Associate Professor and Researcher at DCU. Thank you both so much for being here this morning. We really do
for having us on.
Really appreciate
Thank
it.
you.